The courtroom had always been a battlefield, but for Judge Malcolm Hayes it wasn't just about the cases he presided over, it was about survival. Sitting on the bench as the first black male judge in the district, Malcolm had long understood that the robe he wore was both armor and a target. His mere presence in that chair, ruling over men who never imagined answering to someone like him, was enough to make enemies. He saw it in the way certain attorneys avoided eye contact, in the murmured whispers of courtroom clerks, and most of all, in the simmering resentment of men like Detective Brian Calloway. 15 years on the force had made Calloway an expert in manipulation. He wasn't just a cop, he was a gatekeeper of an old system that thrived on fear and silence. He had sent countless young black men to prison on flimsy evidence, fabricated reports, and coerced testimonies. And the system had rewarded him for it. No one questioned him, no one challenged him. Until Malcolm. The tension between them had been brewing for months, ever since Malcolm had started overturning cases that had Calloway's fingerprints all over them. The detective wasn't used to losing. His power came from knowing that his word was enough to condemn a man, that no judge dared to call him a liar. But Malcolm wasn't just any judge. The moment that lit the match came with the People versus Isaiah Reynolds, a young black man facing armed robbery charges. The case was weak, full of gaps. The surveillance footage that could have cleared him had somehow gone missing. The witness testimony was inconsistent, but Calloway's word, that was enough for the prosecution to proceed. Until Malcolm tore it apart. The courtroom had been packed when he dismissed the case. The air was thick with something unspoken, something heavier than the law itself. Malcolm had watched Calloway's jaw tighten, his fingers twitch. There was something dangerous in his eyes. After court adjourned, Malcolm stood from his chair, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him like a storm cloud. He knew what men like Calloway were capable of. He had seen it growing up, watching his father, a civil rights attorney, lose case after case to men in uniform who were never held accountable. His mother, a teacher, had taught him that knowledge was his greatest weapon, but no book had prepared him for the way Calloway looked at him now, like he was a problem that needed to be solved. As Malcolm stepped down from the bench, he felt it before he saw it, the shift in energy, the sharp edge of something dangerous coiling in the air. He turned just in time to see Calloway lingering near the exit, his expression unreadable. Then, barely audible but razor-sharp, Calloway muttered under his breath, "You don't belong here." Malcolm didn't flinch. He held his gaze. He had been fighting men like Calloway his entire life, but this time he had no idea just how far the detective was willing to go. The courtroom was thick with tension as Judge Malcolm Hayes took his seat on the bench. The weight of the day's decision pressed against his chest, but he didn't let it show. A judge's face had to be unreadable, but Malcolm knew that everyone in this room, especially Detective Brian Calloway, was waiting for his next move. The case before him, the People versus Isaiah Reynolds, had all the makings of another wrongful conviction. Calloway had built the entire case around a single shaky witness statement, a missing surveillance tape, and his own sworn testimony. It was nothing new, just another young black man being fed into the system, another life destroyed by a lie wrapped in legal procedure. But not today. Malcolm adjusted his robe and looked out over the packed courtroom. The defense attorney sat rigid, clutching his notes like a lifeline. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious man who had built his career on trusting officers like Calloway, waited impatiently for the ruling. Calloway himself leaned back in the gallery, arms crossed, exuding the same smug arrogance he always carried, because in his mind, this was a formality. His kind always won. Malcolm's voice was steady when he spoke. After reviewing the evidence, or rather, the lack thereof, he let the words settle, watching the prosecutor shift uncomfortably. This court finds no substantial basis to proceed with this case. The words hung in the air for a moment, before Malcolm delivered the final blow. Case dismissed. The reaction was immediate. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some gasped, others whispered. Isaiah Reynolds let out a breath he'd been holding for weeks. His mother, sitting in the back, clutched her chest in disbelief, tears brimming in her eyes. But it was Calloway's reaction Malcolm was waiting for. The detective's entire body stiffened, his jaw clenched. For the first time in years, the system had turned against him, however briefly, and he wasn't taking it well. Malcolm caught the moment Calloway's fingers twitched at his side, as if fighting the urge to react, to remind everyone in this room who really held the power. But instead, Calloway forced a smile, tight, cold, dangerous. He stood, adjusting his jacket, and walked toward the exit, but not before pausing near the bench. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The way he looked at Malcolm, like a predator sizing up prey, was enough. Malcolm felt the weight of it as he stepped down from the bench. The room emptied around him, but Calloway's presence lingered, a shadow stretching across his path. Then, just as Malcolm reached the exit, a voice cut through the murmurs. Calloway, low, calm, but dripping with something venomous. You really think this changes anything? Malcolm didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because deep down he already knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The courthouse was nearly empty by the time Judge Malcolm Hayes made his way down the hall. The echoes of his own footsteps filled the space, each step a reminder of the weight he carried. Not just as a judge, but as a black man who had just challenged the wrong cop. He knew the risk, he always had, but today it felt different. The tension that had simmered between him and Detective Brian Calloway had finally boiled over, and Malcolm could still feel the burn of Calloway's gaze long after the detective had left the courtroom. As he turned the corner toward his chambers, he barely registered the shadow moving behind him, until it was too late. A sudden, crushing force wrapped around his throat, slamming him backward against the cold marble wall. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain up his spine. His hands instinctively shot up, clawing at the grip, choking the air from his lungs. Calloway. His face was inches from Malcolm's, eyes dark with something raw and unhinged. You think you can humiliate me? Calloway hissed, his fingers tightening. The pressure against Malcolm's windpipe sent a wave of panic through his body, but he forced himself to stay focused. This wasn't the first time a man like Calloway had tried to put him in his place, but it would be the last. Malcolm's vision blurred at the edges, his lungs burning. The courthouse hallway, usually a symbol of law and order, was now a silent witness to the purest form of power abuse. And no one was coming to stop it. He had seconds, maybe less, before he lost consciousness. His fingers dug into Calloway's wrist, but the detective was too strong, too fueled by rage and a lifetime of unchecked authority. Then Malcolm did the only thing he could. With the last bit of strength he had left, he shifted his weight and drove his knee upward, striking Calloway hard in the ribs. The reaction was instant. Calloway's grip faltered, just enough. Malcolm twisted his body, breaking free from the hold and slamming Calloway's arm against the wall. The detective let out a grunt of pain, stumbling backward. And just like that, the balance had shifted. Calloway, the man who had spent years controlling the fates of others, was now on the defensive. Malcolm wasted no time. He grabbed Calloway's arm, twisted it behind his back, and forced him onto the cold, unforgiving floor. The detective let out a choked breath as Malcolm pinned him down, his own weight pressing against the man who had just tried to kill him. For the first time, Calloway felt powerless, and Malcolm made sure he knew it. The silence was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps. More officers. More men in blue. And Malcolm knew exactly what would happen next. But he refused to let them rewrite this story. Not this time. The moment Judge Malcolm Hayes looked up from the cold marble floor, he knew the odds had just turned against him. The doors to the courthouse hallway burst open, and suddenly the space was flooded with blue, uniformed officers. Calloway's people stormed in, their hands instinctively hovering over their holsters, their eyes darting between the scene before them. Malcolm still had Calloway pinned to the ground, the detective's arm twisted behind his back. He could feel the tension radiating from Calloway's body, the humiliation, the rage. But it was nothing compared to what was happening around them now. The officers hesitated for just a second. Then one of them, Sergeant Ray Dixon, a man Malcolm recognized from previous cases, stepped forward, barking orders. "Judge Hayes, stand down. Now!" The command rang out, slicing through the air. Malcolm didn't move. Not yet. He could hear the shift of boots, the tightening of grips around weapons. He knew exactly how this looked. A black man over a downed white officer. It didn't matter that Calloway had attacked him. It didn't matter that the bruises were already forming around his throat. What mattered was the narrative they were about to spin. Malcolm took a slow breath, loosening his hold on Calloway just enough to make a statement, but not enough to show submission. His voice was steady. "Are you arresting me, Sergeant?" The question froze the room for a brief second. Dixon's jaw tightened. They had no legal ground to detain him, and they knew it. But legal grounds had never stopped them before. Malcolm could see it in Calloway's eyes. Even through the pain, there was satisfaction. He was waiting for it, waiting for one of them to step forward, slap cuffs on Malcolm, and flip the story. Waiting for them to make sure that when this hit the news, it wouldn't be about a detective caught attacking a judge. It would be about a hostile suspect resisting arrest. And for a moment Malcolm wondered, would they really go that far? Then he remembered. They already had. Before Dixon could answer, the moment cracked wide open. A voice, sharp, authoritative, cut through the tension. "Back off." Every head turned. At the end of the hall stood Captain James Holloway, one of the highest-ranking officers in the precinct. His face was set like stone, his eyes locked on Calloway still struggling beneath Malcolm's grip. The officers hesitated. Calloway's breathing hitched. And then, like a slow unraveling, the weight of the moment shifted. Malcolm could feel it. For the first time, maybe just for this moment, the system wasn't bending for them. Not yet. The interrogation room was cold, suffocating in its stillness. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across the metal table. Judge Malcolm Hayes sat on one side, his back straight, his face unreadable. Across from him, Detective Brian Calloway nursed his injured wrist, his face twisted in quiet rage. Calloway should have been the one in handcuffs. Instead, Malcolm was the one being questioned. It was a setup, he knew it, and so did they. Across the room, Sergeant Ray Dixon leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Calloway had his allies here, that much was clear. The silence stretched until Calloway finally spoke, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "You really screwed yourself this time, Judge." He rolled his injured wrist, wincing slightly, but the smugness in his eyes never wavered. "Laying hands on an officer, that's assault." Malcolm didn't react. He had spent years in courtrooms facing men like Calloway, men who twisted the law to suit their own power. This wasn't new. Calloway leaned forward, voice lowering. "You know how this works. My word against yours. And guess who they'll believe?" Malcolm let the words settle before he spoke, his voice calm, deliberate. The cameras in the courtroom were rolling. Calloway froze. It was subtle, the slightest twitch of his jaw, the flicker of something behind his eyes, but Malcolm caught it. He pressed forward. An entire hallway is under surveillance, every second, every move, and now that footage is everywhere. A heavy silence filled the room. Dixon shifted uncomfortably. Calloway's fingers curled into a fist, but his bravado cracked just enough for Malcolm to see it. Fear. For the first time, Calloway wasn't in control. Malcolm leaned back, exhaling slowly. "So tell me, Detective, what happens when the world sees what you did?" Calloway clenched his jaw, but he had no response. Because for the first time in his life, his version of the story didn't matter. And he knew it. The video hit the internet like a wildfire. The footage of Detective Brian Calloway attacking Judge Malcolm Hayes in the courthouse hallway spread across social media, news outlets, and primetime broadcasts within hours. The world had seen everything. The moment Calloway wrapped his hands around Malcolm's throat, the struggle, the shift in power, and the look of pure rage when Calloway found himself pinned beneath the man he had tried to silence. For the first time, the narrative wasn't in their control. Inside the precinct, chaos erupted. Protests began forming outside the courthouse, growing louder by the hour. Calls for Calloway's immediate arrest flooded City Hall. The police department was scrambling, desperately trying to contain the fallout, to find a way to protect one of their own without collapsing under the pressure of public outrage. But this time, there was no saving him. Malcolm sat in his office, his phone buzzing non-stop. Calls from journalists, attorneys, civil rights leaders, and people he hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone wanted a statement. Everyone wanted to know what happened next. Then came the unexpected twist. His office phone rang. The district attorney. "Malcolm," the DA's voice was clipped, urgent. "Calloway's trying to cut a deal." Malcolm's grip tightened around the receiver. "A deal? He's offering names, corrupt officers, judges, prosecutors, says he can connect them all if we give him a reduced sentence." Malcolm let the words settle, the weight of them pressing into his chest. He had spent years trying to expose the cracks in this system, and now the man who had spent his career abusing it was willing to burn it all down, just to save himself. But Malcolm wasn't interested in deals. He exhaled slowly, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "No." A pause. Then the DA sighed. "I figured you'd say that." Malcolm leaned forward, his jaw set. "Calloway doesn't get to walk away from this, because justice didn't come with bargains. And this time Calloway wasn't going to escape the consequences." The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and outside, crowds gathered, their voices echoing through the halls of justice. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashing, waiting for the final moment. The sentencing of Detective Brian Calloway. Malcolm Hayes sat at the front, his face unreadable. He had spent weeks watching this case unfold, listening as Calloway's colleagues testified against him, not out of morality, but self-preservation. The footage had done its job. Calloway was untouchable, until he wasn't. The judge presiding over the case cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "Brian Calloway, for the charges of felony assault, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power, this court sentences you to life in prison without parole." A collective exhale swept through the room. Some gasped, others whispered. Malcolm didn't react. He simply watched as Calloway sat motionless, his once unshakable arrogance replaced with something hollow, something final. For the first time, Calloway truly understood what it meant to be powerless. As officers escorted him away in shackles, their grips firm, Malcolm met his eyes one last time. There was no smugness left, no threats. Just a man realizing the system he had once manipulated had now buried him alive. But Malcolm knew this wasn't victory. It was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Calloway's sentencing ripped the department open from the inside. His desperate attempt to save himself had unraveled a network of corruption, officers, prosecutors, even judges. One by one, the system began to devour its own. Some resigned, some were arrested, some ran. And Malcolm, he didn't celebrate, he worked. He sat in meetings with lawmakers pushing for reform. He reviewed cases Calloway had touched, ensuring justice wasn't just about one conviction but a systemic change. And late at night, alone in his office, he let himself acknowledge one undeniable truth. For the first time in his life, he had shaken the foundation of the system. But the fight was far from over. It never was. This wasn't just a story about a corrupt cop finally facing justice. This was about power, control, and the fight for accountability. For years, men like Brian Calloway operated unchecked, bending the law to serve themselves, believing that the system would always protect them. And most of the time it did, until someone like Judge Malcolm Hayes refused to let it continue. This story was about what happens when someone stands up, even when the odds are stacked against them. But the real question is, what happens next? Calloway went down, but corruption doesn't die with one man. The system doesn't fix itself overnight. There are countless others like him, still hiding behind badges, titles, and power, waiting for their turn to abuse it. So we ask you, what would you have done in Malcolm's place? Would you have fought back? Would you have risked everything to expose the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's have a real conversation. And if you want more stories that challenge, inspire, and shake you to your core, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because trust me, this is just the beginning. Justice isn't a moment, it's a battle, and it's one we have to keep fighting.